Okay. All right. Um, wait, what?
Okay.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay. So because we are having to do this on a wireless connection, once I start talking, I'm probably going to turn invisible because that will reduce the chances of the whole thing crashing. But before that, I just like introduce my partner here, Anthea Farr. All right. Fine. Okay. So today we are going to be talking about wild bees. And well, you are probably very familiar with some species like the European honeybee or groups like the bumblebees. There's a lot of them out there, and I thought it would be fun to take the time to introduce you to some of the other ones. So, topics to be discussed. First of all, what exactly is a bee? And then what is it that bees are good for? And after that, we will start showing you some pictures and talking about the different groups of bees that are in the local area, as well as some of our observations from when we surveyed a local property. And after that, we'll be talking about some of the many challenges facing bees, both old and new. And then Anthea will finish off by talking about some of the ways you can help bees. And at the end of all that, we'll have some time for questions, hopefully. So, what are bees? Is that a bee? How about that? They look a lot like bees. Maybe all of these are bees. However, if you look closely, you can probably detect that they're not. This guy up here in the top left has clubbed antennae, which makes it a sawfly. Then the top right, it has very, very large eyes taking up most of the head and only 2 wings. That's a fly. Bees, in popular knowledge, they're black and yellow. They make honey. They live in hives. They can sting you, but then they die. And they're always very, very busy. And you probably have some idea about the fact that bees might not all be true. But did you know that none of them are true for most bees? In fact, bees come in all sorts of different colors, and it is only about 9% of bees globally that they're social and live in hives and make honey to care for a large community of bees. As well, solitary bees, which make up most of the bees in the world, can actually sting repeatedly. They're just extremely reluctant to sting humans, so we don't really think about them. So defining a bee. Taxonomically, all bees are grouped together in a clade, Anthophila, which, as you know from studying your classical Greek, means flower lover. And it is one major difference that sets them apart from their most closely related insects in the order Hymenoptera. So that includes ants, wasps, bees, and sawflies. What makes bees special is that they have setae. And setae are these hairs with microscopic branching that evolved to enable better pollen collection. Most bees have areas on their body called scopa with a large concentration of setae that they use to transport pollen back to their nest. But even bees that are almost completely hairless will still have those branching hairs in the hairs that they do have. So, physical characteristics of bees. As you all know, bees have 5 eyes. Well, okay, some people might not know that, but it's true. They have 3 light-sensitive ocelli that help them determine the time of day and when it's best to go foraging. As well, if you were a bee, pretty much all of your senses would take place coming at you from input in your antennae. Their antennae enable them to touch, smell, taste, and even hear. And if you wanted a snack, you would have to choose which part of your mouth you were going to use to eat, because bees have mandibles for chewing and as well a specialized tongue for sucking up nectar. And while bees do have the ability to see a wide range of colors, it's quite different than us because their vision is shifted into the ultraviolet range. Now, for bees, when you think of bees, you'll probably think about the fact that they live together, but that's actually not true for a lot of them. A lot of them, there's only one female in a nest. She's the queen. She's all the worker. She does it all herself. And then she'll lay an egg, and that egg will grow up slowly into a prepupal stage. Now, depending on whether this is a species that emerges in spring or summer, the pupa will have to determine how long it needs to pause its development before turning into a full pupa and metamorphosizing. This pause is called diapause. For more social insects, like bumblebees, the queen will start laying out a generation of workers, and then those workers will help create the food supply to build successive workers until they finally have enough food stored up to allow the creation of males and reproduction for the next generation of queens. Now, as I mentioned before, most bees are solitary. 75% of them, in fact, of all the bee species in the world are solitary. And those guys have to deal with the brood parasites. 15% of all bee species don't even raise their own kids. They just lay their eggs in the nests of other bees that create the food, and then their larvae will hatch first, take all the food, and either murder the other larvae for additional food, or they'll just leave it to starve. Social bees, like honeybees and bumblebees, are a minority of species, but even these guys have their own parasites. There are some species of bumblebee that are social parasites, where they will kill the original queen and then convince the remaining hive to work for them and raise the children of the social parasite, even though they're a different species. So we've covered a few things that make a bee a bee. Most technically, it's a hymenopteran clade with specialized hairs, but it's also good to keep in mind that there's various forms of sociality within the bee community, and most bees could sting as much as they want. They just don't want to sting humans. And they come in very many colors, like this tropical bee. So why care about them? Well, I'm not going to spend too long on this because you are naturalists and you're quite familiar with these sorts of issues. But it's good to remember that a lot of the food in the world comes from bees, and even crops that aren't developed for food, like medicinal and textile crops, they also often require animal pollination. About 300,000 species of flowering plants in the world depend on some degree of animal pollination, and most of those require bees. As well, bees are very useful as ecosystem indicators and keeping the food chain intact. I just wanted to say that so you can see this picture of a spider eating a bee. As well, in Canada, honeybees produce almost $720 million worth of value just in terms of the food in vegetable and fruits. But the biggest contribution in Canada would be with products like canola oil. And when you add all that in, you get up to an estimated $5.5 billion dedicated only to honeybee production. Sorry, $5.5 billion that we'd lose without honeybee production. And we haven't actually managed to come up with an assessment of how much is contributed from wild pollinators, which is definitely not zero. So maybe we should care, but just how many of these things are there? In BC, there are 483 confirmed species. And here in the Pacific montane, the bar on the far left, you can see that there are 200 species just in this area. However, there's always more to find. With the trend of DNA analysis revealing new species continues, there's a Mr. Sheffield who helped contribute this data. He estimates that there will be over 600 species in British Columbia. So without further ado, it's time to introduce the local bees. As you can see, they are not all small and black and yellow. They come in all shapes and sizes and colors. And in fact, there are 5 of the 7 global families of bees present just in British Columbia. And a sixth is almost certainly here, although we only have 1 or 2 specimens. As well, they have many different behaviors. So I'm just gonna let you see there's a brood parasite finishing the nest that the other one dug out. And here's one nesting in wood. But before we get into all of those guys, I think first we should start with the honeybee, someone you all know. Honeybees were first introduced to North America in the 17th century. And since then, they've sort of taken the role of cows to bison. Nowadays, they're agricultural animals. And while there are a few feral colonies, for the most part, they should be thought of as distinct from the natural ecosystem. And in terms of identification, if you ever want to make really sure the bee you're looking at is a honeybee, you need to check his eyeballs for hair. Here's one you're probably familiar with. This is our largest native bee species, Bombas vosnesenski. This is a queen, and she's out early in the spring to forage for food. You can tell it's a Bombas vosnesenski because of the bright yellow face and the 2 distinctive color areas at the front and the back of the body. With other bee species, it can sometimes be trickier to ID them. This one is Bombas Californicus. And what is it you look for when you try and identify a bee? Well, first, you need to look at the abdomen and the color patterns there. It goes from here, we see that it goes from yellow to red to black. But if that's not enough, you might have to look at the hairs on the leg that contribute to the pollen basket. Or maybe the length of the tongue, or the length of the cheek, or whether the hairs on the back are pure yellow or black or a mixture of black and yellow. There are many different things that go into IDing a species, but if you're able to find all of these different things and feel confident in your analysis of them, you might get it right. You might not, but you might. One of the trickier bees we have around here is Bombas flavifrons. It is quite variable, and it can often be confused with Bombas mixtus. A good way to tell them apart is mixtus usually has this distinctive black band between the yellow and the orange, which you won't see in Bombas flavifrons. As well, as Bombas mixtus gets older, it starts to lose the hair. As you can cleanly see here, it's gone entirely green. Oh, no, sorry, I mean, look below the frog, and you'll see that the top of the thorax is almost totally bald. Another cute species is Bombas Californicus. It has a much shorter coat of hair, and it noticed the black head, so you know it's not vosnesenski. Bombas impatiens is the eastern bumblebee, and it is an introduced species that is becoming progressively more common in this area. Anthea will talk a little bit more about it later. And last but not least, in terms of the common bumblebees of our area, is Bombas vancouverensis. This is an interesting one because we used to think it was called Bombas bifarius, but recently scientists have done DNA work and they found that Bombas bifarius is 2 species that can look identical. However, they don't interbreed and have different genetics. So now we know that the ones west of the Rockies should be Bombas vancouverensis. So now, something very, very different, we have Carpenter bees. These are the small Carpenter bees, as you can see by the dandelion there on the right. It's much smaller than a bumblebee. These ones are Ceratina. And a good way to tell between males and females is the males have this white blaze on the face that makes them stand out. Both of them are very small and shiny and very dark, and they will nest in woods, in any holes they can find in wood. Nomada are a bee that look a lot like a wasp, and they use this coloration for defense, as well as being able to remain somewhat undetected from other bees. They parasitize mining bees for the most part. And another very morphologically distinct genus in Apidae is Melisodes. These are the longhorn bees, so named because the males have quite long antennae. And the females are distinctive because of their very, very bushy scopa on the hind legs. That's why we call them pollen pants. And here is a bee that looks very, very happy. It's one of my mom's favorite bees. She calls it the happy face bee. Look on the left, you can clearly see the happy face on its back. However, this bee is actually the mortal enemy of Melisodes, and it is almost exclusively parasitizing the nests of Melisodes. Now, you'll notice that I put the scientific name up at the top, but what I think it is. Fairly confident, but as for any of our identifications in this talk, they're not 100%. Now, these ones are very small indeed, and that's part of why they're called sweat bees, because they're so small that they can derive benefit from eating sweat. Well, in theory, we haven't actually observed this, but there are many different kinds of bees in these two main genera of Lasioglossum and Halictus. And they're often found on weedy flowers, and whenever you see a small, fast-flying insect, you might think instinctively it's a fly, but oftentimes it's a bee if you can look closely. They are ground-nesting bees, as you can see by the one in the bottom left. And one of the prettiest bee genera that lives here is Agapostamin. Agapostamin texanum has brilliant green females, and males have a yellow and black striped abdomen that stands out. But even in this family, there's parasites. Sphacodes are black and red bees that lay their eggs in the nests of other sweat bees. What's this? This guy is in the family Megachilidae. It's actually a woman or a female bee because you can see it's got all that pollen on its belly. That's why the family Megachilidae is referred to as the hairy belly bees. In particular, this genus, Megachili, are called leafcutter bees because they will cut out leaves from plants to line their nests with. And the males also have these impressive mustaches, if you look at the bottom left there. Mason bees are, in the Osmia genus, are a group of Megachilidae bees that nest almost exclusively in wood. And you can identify them because they're quite shiny. They're kind of a metallic greeny blue color, and they will also have the hairs on the belly when they're a female carrying pollen. The parasitic mason bee, Coleoxys, uses the sharp spines on the sides of its abdomen there in order to cut into the cells of leafcutter bees. So they usually try and protect their larvae by lining the cells with these leaves, but evolution had other plans. And here's one that looks a lot like a wasp. These are called carter bees. This particular one is introduced from Europe. It's the European carter bee, and they are called that because they scrape the hairs off plant leaves and use these fibers to line their nests with. Now they look, especially from the side, he looks much more like a wasp, and he looks quite cute and friendly, but he's not, he's a jerk. If you watch them for a while, you will see them ramming into other bees at high speed and not letting any other bees get into the flowers within, say a 2 meter squared area. They're extremely territorial. And this is a group of small mining bees, Hariades hoplites, that we didn't notice at first. This happens to even, professional entomologists too sometimes, where specimens get deposited and then later with genetic analysis, we realize that we've discovered a new species a much longer time ago. I did mention mining bees before, and this is one. They actually dig out burrows into the soil that can be, feet deep. And this is a queen. You can tell because of the big fluffy legs. Another good way to tell when something is a mining bee is because the female mining bees have these really big bushy eyebrows. So we think of them as eyebrow bees. And it doesn't matter the color, even the dark ones should have dark eyebrows, if you can look really closely. This time of year, if you look in the spring, if you're looking in loose sandy soil, you can often see little heads poking up as they start to emerge. This is a male mining bee right here. So they often get overlooked, but they're out there. And last but not least, the fifth family is Crecitidae. These are the polyester bees, so named because they are able to secrete a compound in their saliva that generates a cellophane-like polyester, which they use to line their nest cells. And this creates a waterproof seal, so they can nest in areas that might otherwise get inundated. And also in Crecitidae are the masked bees. These ones have a special adaptation of their own, where instead of collecting pollen on the outside of their bodies, they actually ingest the pollen stored in their crop and then regurgitate it out later. They're known as masked bees because the males have these bright masks over their faces that you can see on the right. Now, for all of our surveys, we just did it with the nets and cameras, which meant we didn't capture them in order to look at them under the microscope or do DNA analysis, which you really need to do to get good ID, but we did our best. We did our survey at the Arosha Brooksdale property, which is at 16th and 192nd, the border between Surrey and Langley. And what we found was about 62 to 70 bee morphospecies. Most of them were in Apidae, but we found a lot in other groups as well, except for Crecitidae, only a couple there. If we're going to compare it with the species distribution within families for all of BC, I've put our numbers there in blue, and you can see that the proportions aren't quite the same. So in BC, most species are actually in Megachilidae and Andrenidae, but these species are often extremely morphologically similar. So in order to differentiate them, you really need to do extensive analysis through a microscope or DNA. Apidae, on the other hand, as you saw, has genera that are quite morphologically diverse. So it was easier for us to pick up on the different species. And of course, what bees you find depends a great deal on the habitat. So when we looked, we were focused mostly on the flowers in crops, the pollinator garden and the flower garden. The pollinator garden is supposed to be all native flowers for the most part, and blackberry, weeds, and riparian. So we tried to cover our bases here. And what we found in terms of the best species, in terms of richness, was number 1 was trailing blackberry. Number 2 was cosmos. Number 3, zinnia. Number 4 was dill. Anthea will talk to you more about the flowers a bit later. Life as a bee isn't all sunshine and roses, as you've probably seen with some rather worrying articles here and there. There are a lot of dangers to being a bee. I'm going to talk about sort of the omnipresent dangers, what's been here from before humans were around. And then we'll sort of transition into the more recent threats and other things that humans are doing. That will be my mom's topic. So as you can see here, we have some bees in trouble. And maybe you can't quite see them, but they're there. The spiders are waiting. The goldenrod crab spider is responsible for most of the predation on solitary bees. And it's estimated that if only 1 to 2% of flowers have a goldenrod crab spider waiting, that is enough to hold population growth in check. Any more than that, and solitary bees probably can't, or they're going to be in trouble. So what about birds? Luckily here, our birds have better sense. We don't have bee eaters, we have flycatchers, and flycatchers know the difference between flies and bees and leave the bees alone. Insects, though, that's a different matter. this weird looking fellow, or actually I shouldn't say that, it could be either. The females of this group, the Canopid Flies, are parasitites of adult bees. And what they do is they will wait on flowers for a bee to appear. And now remember, bees can't actually see red. So what they can do is quickly fly up to a bee undetected, jab them, lay an egg in the abdomen, and then the maggot will devour the bee. Another threat is the jewel wasp, Crecitidae. These ones don't go so much for stealth. However, what they have a lot of armor instead. And then what they can do is when they go into an occupied bee hole, like this one here, if the bee tries to fight back, the jewel wasp is able to curl itself into a tight ball, and the bee will not be able to damage it whatsoever. It doesn't actually kill the bees, but what it will do, like other bee parasites, is it will lay its eggs in the nest, and then those eggs will hatch before the bee's eggs and take the food. For the most part, wasps and bees don't really bother each other, and they're quite indifferent to each other's existence. However, there is an exception. The genus Phyllanthus are bee wolves. And for the most part, they are just like any other pollinator, eating pollen and nectar and contributing to the flowers. But at a certain time of year, when it's time for reproduction, bee wolves will go on a murderous rampage. One bee wolf is capable of killing as many as 120 bees just for its own brood. And they do this by attacking a bee in midair and injecting them with paralyzing venom. A new threat from the wasps, as you probably heard called the Japanese murder hornet. Oh, well, yeah, it's the Asian giant hornet, but it gets called the murder hornet. So these guys evolved with honeybees in Asia, and the honeybees in Asia know enough that they can mob the hornet and cover it until the internal temperature inside the ball becomes just hot enough for the hornet to die, because they can't actually sting or bite the hornet enough to damage it. But without this kind of learned behavior, bees over in North America would be extremely vulnerable to these guys. But so far, we haven't had any major establishing colonies. There was a big one in Washington that got taken out last year. And hopefully, we will continue this trend. No hives have been discovered in BC so far this year. Now, last but not least, we have a potential threat that was supposed to be an ally, the European honeybee. European honeybees came here to help with pollination in the 17th century, but they carry a lot of diseases. They can carry mites into wild populations, sort of the way that farmed salmon can infect wild salmon. So we're not too sure about the extent of this, but what we do know is that there has been a study in California, and what they found was that looking specifically at the pollination of apple trees, that just having honeybee hives present was enough to reduce the numbers of wild bees to such an extent that the apple production actually decreased. So while honeybees can be valuable assets in some circumstances, we know there are some circumstances where they're going to cause more harm than good. And we really need to work on more research to figure out what exactly those circumstances are. And now, with that said, we're going to fly over to Anthea, and she will talk to you a little bit about her portion of the talk.
Hey. Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about human-caused threats to bees, and then talk about the ways we can help bees. A new study suggests that the numbers of wild bee species have declined worldwide by as much as 25%. Researchers looked at bee collections, from 2006 to 2015 versus earlier than the 1990s to reach this conclusion. They believe humans are responsible for the decline. If bees had nightmares, maybe they'd be about human-caused threats, habitat loss, aliens, pesticides, disease, climate change. I'm going to talk briefly about each of these. Habitat loss is the greatest threat bees face. Here in Langley and Surrey, we're losing natural habitat with remarkable speed. And who knows how many native bees are being lost as well. Aliens. Here's an example. The eastern bumblebee was brought to the West Coast to pollinate greenhouse crops, but it soon escaped or was allowed to forage outside the greenhouses. It's now abundant throughout Langley and Surrey, and it may be the most common bumblebee at Melisodes, competing with our native bees. Pesticides. They can kill non-target as well as target insects. Neonicotinoids, neonics for short, are insecticides put right inside the seeds. This results in all parts of a flower, including its pollen and nectar, containing the insecticide. Neonics can directly kill native bees or impair them, such as affecting their brains so they can't find their way home. Diseases. Honeybee hives are moved from one coast to another in USA to pollinate crops such as almonds. Diseases can move with them, and so much moving stresses the honeybees, making them more susceptible to viruses that may cause CCD, colony collapse disorder. Bumblebees are also moved around. The buff-tailed bumblebees are raised in factories in Europe, and then they're shipped all over the world to other countries for crop pollination. European pathogens often come with them, devastating native bees, such as the giant golden bumblebee in Chile. In the early 1990s, North American bumblebee colonies were transported to Europe to be raised over there, then brought back to America to pollinate greenhouse crops. A fungal pathogen came back with them, which may be why our Western bumblebees are in so much trouble. Corey did not show you a photo of a Western bumblebee because we've never seen one. Climate change. New evidence suggests that recent extreme temperatures due to climate change have killed bumblebees in Europe and in the US. Climate change may also threaten specialist bees, such as those who only feed on one flower or who live in one special habitat. Or it could cause mismatches between timing of blossoms and timing of bees emerging. The parrot is just to illustrate that there will likely be unexpected results of climate change that no one has even thought of yet. So how can we give our wild bees and other pollinators a helping hand? The most obvious way is to provide food. Some folks may be able to offer bees a wide smorgasbord of flowers. This is the garden at Arosha Brooksdale. Other folks may only have space for one pot and one flower, but every little bit helps. Some bees like a big landing pad. This flower is calendula. And what you plant for bees will also likely help butterflies, such as this painted lady, and many other pollinators. Small flowers like this baby blue eyes may attract some of our small native bees. Some of you may remember Simon and Garfunkel's song from the 60s. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. That could well be the theme song for a happy bee. Bees really do like herbs. Here's a bumblebee feeding on rosemary, and here's a mason bee on thyme. So if you grow herbs and allow some of them to bloom, you'll soon see a happy pollinator. Pretty much all herb flowers make bees happy, so the theme song could continue as chives and dill and fennel and mint. Here, a bumblebee is feeding on one of my chives. So here's a question. How long is pollinating season for wild bees in this area? Or how many months do they need flowers? The answer is about 7 months, right from cherry blossom time to pumpkin carving time. Early spring is the most critical time when the queen bumblebees emerge. Honeybees will also be out looking for food in early spring. This one has found a willow catkin in Campbell Valley Park. And here a mining bee has found a willow catkin. To help pollinators at this critical time, it's best to plant flowers they like and that bloom early. My winter heather starts blooming long before bee season, so it's ready and waiting for any bumblebees that emerge on a warm day in February or March. A warm enough days for bees is usually when the temperature is at least 10 degrees. Summer's the next season, and this is our top pick for garden flowers, and it's called Cosmos. It lasts a long time. The small garden by Arosha's welcome sign is almost entirely Cosmos, and we have observed 24 different kinds of pollinators there. You can even buy Cosmos seeds that help both pollinators and our BC health system, featuring Dr. Bonnie Henry on the packet. In the fall, the aster is a good perennial flower that can keep flowering right to pumpkin carving season. Here, a leafcutter bee is feeding on an aster at Melaster. Weeds, please. What weeds, such as dandelions, offer is a supply of food when other flowers may not be available. We found that weeds had a high diversity of pollinators. So, if you can allow a few dandelions or hawkweeds or buttercups to flower, you will be helping wild bees of many sizes, colors, and patterns. If you have a thing about weeds, you can snip off the blooms before they go to seed. Pollinators love blackberry flowers. Here you can see bees lining up for a chance to feed on our native trailing blackberry. As Corey pointed out, this is one of our best native plants for bees. Bees also love Himalayan blackberry flowers. All blackberries are in the genus Rubus. Studies of Rubus pollen have found it ranks highly in proteins, sugars, and antioxidants compared with other flowers. So if you have some Himalayan blackberry on your property and can control it rather than remove it, you'll again be helping many kinds of wild bees. Bees will also nest in Himalayan blackberry. This photo was taken at Force and Watson. You can just see a metallic green osmia bee excavating a nest inside a blackberry branch, which takes us to the second way you can help pollinators. Provide nesting habitat. You can put up nest boxes for mason bees. Wild Birds Unlimited sell them, or you can make your own. Keeping natural nest sites such as logs is also helpful. Or leaving a patch of dirt in a sunny area will provide nest sites. I am pointing to a mining bee nest that we found at Arosha. Mining bees also love patches of sand in a sunny spot. This one is at High Knoll Park, taken yesterday. It's the miserable andrena. I'm not sure why it's called that, but if you put some sand in your garden, perhaps it will be less miserable. Sometimes helping bees may just require a change in attitude. If you see coin-shaped holes in your rose leaves, be tolerant. Leafcutter bees are good pollinators. This photo is of our rose leaf and our leafcutter bee here in Cloverdale. What about winter? Where are our native bees when it looks like this? Most bee species use their nest sites to winter in as pupae. Bumblebee queens are different. They may just burrow down into the soil or leaf litter. Where the yellow arrow is, you might be able to see just part of a bumblebee. It wants a new home for winter because By now, its old nest may be moldy or have maggots in it. Another way to help wild bees is to avoid using pesticides. There are all kinds of natural, less harmful recipes on the internet. Lemons, garlic, chili peppers, soaps, and vegetable oils may feature in these do-it-yourself recipes. We haven't tried them, but they may work. You should also try to avoid using seeds treated with neonics. West Coast Seeds and Mackenzie Seeds are two companies whose websites state they have never used neonics and never will use them. Share your observations. You could send your bee photos to iNaturalist or Bumblebee Watch. The more we learn, the better we'll be able to monitor pollinators and look after them. Be informed. This is one of my favorite books, The Bees in Your Backyard. You can also support local conservation groups such as the Xerxes Society. This North American society protects insects and other invertebrates and their habitats. The wild bees will be grateful for any help you can give them. There's a couple of our longhorn bees. To summarize, we have many kinds of wild bees here in Langley and Surrey. Bees face a number of threats and some species are disappearing. There are many ways we can help our wild bees. To help bees, provide food for 3 seasons, maintain nest sites, avoid pesticides, share observations, be informed. We'd like to thank all the Arosha folks and others who helped us with this study. And that concludes our talk.
Quick do something, she says. All right, let's try and get the video back up.
You can
Thank you very
just
much,
stop sharing your
Anthea
screen.
and Corey and Anthea, thank you very much. That was very well done. Very enjoyable.
Do we have any questions, folks?
I've got a question.
There we go.
Photography was fantastic. How long did it actually take you to put this whole thing together? And are they mostly your own photographs?
The only photographs that aren't our own are like ones of the Asian giant hornet and stuff, and then a few at the beginning. You might have noticed them because they were incredibly high definition, so I got those from the public domain photos available. But otherwise, yes, we did take all of them.
It took quite a while to put it together.
Yeah.
How many years has this process been to get to this point?
Well, like in terms of our surveys at Arosha, that data that I presented was only over a course of 2 years, although we have been looking in other years.
So it's been 4 years of data, I guess. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful photography. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
I've got heads moving out front, and I saw some big black bees with a little bit of yellow in the front, which I didn't know they were bees. They look like flies, but that must be one of those early bees. Should they be out now?
Yes, they are out now. The Vosnesenski's out, and we've seen Mixtus out. And of course, the mining bees are out in Hynall Park, and honeybees are out.
Okay,
There
so
are also large black flies that can have sort of a yellowish face, Canopid flies, but they have sort of very spiky hairs coming off the abdomen. They're not fuzzy.
And the drone flies.
Yeah, I didn't get that close, but I noticed that the wings were not sticking out. They were tucked in to the body side. So that's not a fly look.
Probably the Vosnesensky bumblebee.
Okay.
Take a photo.
They don't hold still long enough for photos.
They don't. They're quite hungry.
But do they mine in the dirt?
Bumblebees just they're classified as cavity nesters. They look for areas wherever they can find them. So that could be holes in the ground, abandoned, mouse burrows or something, or
Okay.
it can be old birds' nests, just any sort of large hole that doesn't look too dangerous.
Okay, so me digging around in the dirt is not going to disturb them or their nesting.
Probably not.
Okay, that's good. And the single bees, the ones that just maintain their own,
Like solitary bees?
yes, yes. So does that mean that the male bees have their own little dwelling and the female bees have their own little dwelling?
Male bees will never own a home.
Okay,
No.
well, that explains it.
Now, the male bees, they will come, and their only purpose is to reproduce. So they will hatch, they will fly around looking for a female, and they do not worry about anything else.
Oh, they don't even eat?
No, they do eat because they need to, keep their lives going long enough to make sure they can reproduce, unlike some moths. But yeah, they do contribute to pollination by visiting flowers, but for the most part, you're not gonna see them around as long as females.
Okay, so I was just gonna ask, shorter lifespan then.
Generally, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Everyone's just blown away.
I have a question. I feel really overwhelmed by all the different species, and I tried to use iNaturalist last year doing the BioBlitz, but do you have any recommendations on learning the bees? Like you mentioned the one book that sounds really good, but what's the best way to learn your bee species?
Yeah, so I think Xerxes does have some material. And like, what's that big book of bumblebees? Only bumblebees that are in Western North America?
Yeah, bumblebees of Western North America, maybe it's called,
Oh,
by the U.S. Forest
I think
Service.
Ted is trying to show it there.
oh, okay.
If anyone can see Ted's pictures.
Oh, yeah, we have that book too. Yeah, it's the bumblebee one. But we also have the Forest Service one, which is just the Western bees, which is, we actually printed it from it was online, and we printed it ourselves because you couldn't actually buy a copy. But that's a good one too. But
Yeah, as for other bees, we don't really have good field guides available for the most part. But there are some resources like UBC Entomology, like the zoology website there. They have a bunch of bees posted and you can sort of look through them and get a sense of what your bee looks most like. But otherwise, I think iNaturalist is a really good resource. So that's a good thing. Sorry.
it's very difficult. I have a terrible problem identifying bees, really, the little ones especially.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you have to content yourself to not getting them to species for the most part.
Right.
Yeah.
And you
But
mentioned
at least iNaturalist does work to some degree, because I did use it quite a bit.
you mentioned Bumblebee Watch as well too, the app.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Any other questions?
I saw one yesterday with an orange derriere. So big.
Yeah, so there's a couple like that. Like if it was really extremely bright orange and it looked like it was sort of in the middle of its abdomen, then it was probably Melanopygus.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah.
Nice.
I have a question. A really good presentation, by the way. It was really interesting. I know nothing about bees. Now I do, but, a little bit. But the wild bees, are you referring to native species or just generally bees that are buzzing around?
So pretty much every species we talked about was native. So we meant native bees. The ones that aren't native, so that's the European Carter bee, the Eastern bumblebee, and the honeybee, of course. But for the most part, pretty much everything we looked at today was all native.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering about the plants, because a lot of the plants you recommended are, or most of them are non-native ornamental species, other than some rubus, but so
Yeah,
they're
well,
all are native species as well as
yeah, so
Yeah.
it's, I wouldn't recommend them over native species, but some people,
Okay.
like some people want garden flowers in their garden that
Right.
are, designed to be really beautiful. And so these are sort of the best ones out of that section.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, the
Yeah.
aster was native.
Right.
It was the great northern aster at Melisodes, and the willows were native. But we could have spent a lot more time talking about native flowers like goldenrod, and
Right.
yeah, we
Yeah. No.
kind of choose garden.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, we were limited by our study area.
Yeah.
Yes.
No,
Garrett?
that's great. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, great presentation, of course. You didn't mention Himalayan Balsam. I know it's an invasive species, but we're seeing a lot of it everywhere. And I've noticed it's a really great magnet for bumblebees late in the summer. I may have mentioned to you, I was down in Surrey Lake Park the last fall, and there's a big patch there. And I think in the space of about 50 yards, I think I counted over 50 bumblebees. Really busy there. So, yeah, sometimes the invasive species even can be useful.
Yes, for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Something I should have mentioned in response to Phil's question is that Dr. Elizabeth L. at SFU, on her website, there's a section called Information for the Public. And in there, based on her own results, she has a list of the top 25 native plants for bees and the top 25 garden plants.
Yeah, Elizabeth's info is very, very good.
Yeah. Well, what was her name? Corey?
Elizabeth L. ELLE is her last name. She's a
Okay.
prof at SFU.
All right. No, thanks for that.
Any other questions, folks? And of course, if you don't have your video on, we can't see you. If you're nodding. No other questions? Well, Leslie had an excellent idea. Leslie suggested we all unmute so we can applaud for the fabulous presentation that was. Really, really excellent, guys.
Right.
So thank you so much. It was really great.
All right.
We could all buzz.
And we've recorded the presentation, so we'll have it up hopefully tomorrow, depending on how quickly I can get through this and organize it. But we should be able to get it up on our Facebook page at least, and I'll ask Nora to send out a link as well.
Great.
But
Thanks a
incredible
lot.
presentation. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Very well done.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Corey. Very well done, and Anthea as well. Thank you.
All right. Well, on that fantastic note, I believe we're all done. Thank you so
All
much,
right.
everybody.
Good night.
Night all.
Great to see everyone. Stay healthy until you get your shot.